overview of today's agenda and give you some housekeeping tips. So first, we're going to start with this welcome and introductions. That's where we are. I'm so excited you all are here. I'm Reverend Rachel Burkhan-Rommelfinger, the Policy and Advocacy Director for Friends of the Parks, and helped put together this lecture today. As folks are coming in, if you'll drop your name, an organization you're related to, the neighborhood you live in, and your favorite way to beat the heat, and your pronouns in the chat, that will help us know who's here today. We are going to have a special brief pre-presentation from Julie Malnak, our Policy and Communications Associate. You might have seen in our e-blast that she did some research related to this topic and is very excited for the presentation today. I'll do a very brief minute or two about how this connects to some of our advocacy and policy work, and then we'll move on to the formal lecture. That should all conclude by about 1 o'clock. And then we'll have time for a question and discussion as much as we need until at least 1:30. And then we'll conclude with some next steps as you can continue to connect to Friends of the Parks work. If you have any tech problems during today's presentation, you can send me a chat message. I am labeled in the participant list as Reverend Rachel Burkhan-Rommelfinger, and I will try to help you as best I can. If you're able, please stay muted during the presentation so we don't get background noise. We really appreciate that. We can also help you mute if you're having trouble, or unmute. We will have a time for discussion and dialogue, and you can unmute or raise your hand at that time or write comments or questions in the chat. And the session is being recorded today, just so that you know. All right. So that kind of moves us closer to the actual lecture, but before we move on to our main speaker, I want to invite Julie Malnak to speak to us today very briefly.
Hi, thank you, Rachel. Like they said, I'm Julie Malnak. I'm the Policy and Communications Associate for Friends of the Parks, and I did my capstone presentation over the urban heat effect at Loyola University Chicago for my Bachelor's of Science degree. So we can get started. So for a brief summary for heat trends in Chicago, the heat island effect is when man-made buildings and infrastructure such as roads, etc., absorbs and re-emit heat more than natural environments. So as you can see on the visual over here on the right, the rural area with the grass and the trees and the water, it allows for plant transpiration and water evaporation from the soil and water penetration to add to a cooling effect, and allows mobility so that heat that does go into the surrounding area has a way to has movement and can leave. While on the other hand, cities are often built with asphalt and pavement and concrete, which is not permeable, which does not allow not only for water penetration for the soil beneath, but also there's no fluctuation or movement. So it can range from 3 to 10 degrees Celsius hotter than perhaps rural areas or areas with more green spaces. Chicago is no exception to this, even though they do have the Great Lake Michigan next to it, which does add a large cooling effect. But as we all know, the lake is a secular area that allows for disproportionate access to the cooling effect. So then at a look to our history, in 1995, there was a great Chicago heat wave, and that was where the temperatures were around 106 degrees, give or take, for about a week. And that is a taste of what the future could look like if we keep going at the pace that we are, in terms of not reducing things as climate change is affecting Chicago. This city was devastatingly unprepared for it, with 739 people who perished in the heat wave. And there were definite trends in the death toll, as in they were in specific areas, as in the south and west sides, and the communities who were affected who were heavily affected were elderly and in Black and Brown communities. Chicago's response was recovery focused and not preventative. So they did add the cooling centers, and they had organizations that would check up on people after during heat waves to make sure people would get out of their houses or had access to these cooling stations, but not they didn't look to ways to prevent rising heat. So this is a visual understanding of what I just said. This here on the left is where it shows the darker areas show lower income areas, while the lighter shows the higher income areas. And then on the right, you can see it is where the highest concentrations of people who perished in the 1995 heat wave. So as you can see in here, it's the west and the southern sides that are pretty dark. And then here you can see the concentration as well as where the people unfortunately died in the heat wave. So as you can see as well, it's west and south. Here are the names of the areas. I thought it was very important to name the neighborhoods where they were greatly affected by the 1995 heat wave. And as you can see, especially with Friends of the Parks, a lot of these communities is where we try to advocate and push for higher investment in their parks, community areas, and overall green spaces. So we're going to take a look at another visual understanding of, so if you look to A, that's where the roof temperatures show how hot in the summers and in other heat extensive areas would be. The darker the color, the hotter the roof temperature is. And like we've seen before, it's the west areas and the southern areas that get particularly hot. And it shows, see the lighter color shows that it's got a cooling effect, even though downtown you would think with all the tall skyscrapers and all the reflection it would be hot, but as you can see, it's over here. And then in section B, you see that heat vulnerability index, which means it calculates all of the adverse heat effects that you would get when it comes to heat and applies it to the populations of the areas and who would be most affected. So the darker areas again show who is most at risk for adverse health effects from heat. So as we can see here, the darker areas are in the south and west, and the darker areas here at who is most at risk is also in the southern areas and the western areas. So not only are they having to deal with the hotter temperatures, but they also are being more affected by them. And then section C shows where the highest amounts of air conditioning consumption is. And you can see downtown, that's pretty dark. That's where the AC is being used. But in the dark areas that we see specifically around here, that's very light, which shows there's a lot of missing infrastructure for these people to be able to handle the heat. So this is a little bit of a textual summary of what I just said about how the same communities that were largely affected in the 1995 heat wave will be affected first and harder as climate change continues to affect Chicago. And as we've seen in studies and probably felt ourselves, the city and the way it's getting is only going to get hotter, especially with the way if we continue the way we are. Access to Lake Michigan is conditionalized, and especially with lack of infrastructure, lack of transit, it's very difficult for people to get to. Cooling off will become, and probably is already, a luxury. It will only get exacerbated. While also there is a disproportionate exposure to greenhouse gases in the other areas in the west and southern areas due to factories, etc. It also doesn't have the lake to push away a lot of the greenhouse gases and a lot of the contaminants in the air. And greenhouse gases such as carbon holds on to heat. So not only are the people getting hotter temperatures, but they also have the mechanisms of greenhouse gases surrounding them that hold more heat. So heat stays there with the pavement, which doesn't allow for transpiration or movement. And so they're just stuck in this heat island. Not only does this take an effect on their physical health, all the like heat stroke, heat sicknesses, but it takes a mental toll on the people as well. And as we know, and as Friends of the Parks pushes for upkeep of their green spaces and additions to their amounts of green spaces in the area, without those, it also takes a mental toll. The extreme heat can affect people throughout their day, their productivity, with no release. It's not only an environmental inequality, but it's another form of environmental racism, as we know that the areas in the West in the West and the South tend to be Black and brown communities. So it's really pushing all these adverse effects on Black and brown communities specifically. So for our future, the current city solutions are green roofs, energy efficient technology, LEED buildings, and increasing green spaces, and also reducing albedo. But increasing green spaces would add in temperature reduction and positive effects on mental and physical health. There needs to be some relief, an immediate relief people can get from the heat, and green spaces provide it, not only in long term as in a reduction, but as just getting out and away from the pavements and the asphalt that just trap and contain heat. Citywide updates to infrastructure, equal access to green spaces, complete switch to renewables, and of course the reduction of asphalt. There are many studies where it shows that the amount of concrete and asphalt is what helps trap the heat inside cities, which makes it an island of heat, where the name comes from. So obviously that was a lot, but when I did this paper and then I heard that we were doing the Depave, I was incredibly excited because school often tells you to read about these things, to read about what needs to be done. And then organizations like Depave and people like Mary Pat McGuire, which we'll hear from, they're the ones who are actually out there and doing it. And I was just so excited and to hear actually about the examples and plans and movements that she and the organization will bring to the table. So thank you for listening, and like you, I am excited to hear.
Thank you so much, Julie, for giving us just a little overview and letting us see into your research. And thank you everyone for listening. I just want to give a quick overview of how I think this connects to our policy and advocacy work at Friends of the Parks. For those who joined and haven't met me, I'm Reverend Rachel Burkhan-Rommelfanger, the Director of Policy and Advocacy. And I know many of you come to this presentation because this redesign theme inspires you for different reasons, right? It might inspire you because you like architecture and landscaping and design, and you're like, how can we redesign our city given the challenges of climate change? Or just because you're interested in new innovations and ideas. And I think we want to promote that, and that's important to our work. But also, as Julie was saying, when we saw that the facts from that 1995 heat wave, the inequality in our city inspires many of you to engage with Friends of the Parks as we push for more investment in our green spaces in the South and West Side. And we push for there to be more investment there because historically there has been disinvestment in those communities. And we want our city to not just react to things like that 1995 heat wave, but find creative solutions that are going to really help our residents to thrive, right? And we want to engage and mobilize and equip you all to help do that, whether you live in those communities or in other parts of the city that you might be an ally to those communities. You also might be here because you heard about all the talk about the museum campus and the new Reimagine the Lakefront work, and how that talked about naturalizing that space and removing some of the impervious surfaces. And I can say that our speaker, Mary Pat McGuire, helped talk to that working group. So you're getting an insight to what inspired that element of the report. And it also, for Friends of the Parks, connects to our long work and advocacy around Soldier Field and those parking lots that are to the east of the drive, that they could become green spaces or at least less impervious spaces in the future. And it connects to issues of flooding and stormwater as we continue to talk about areas along our rivers and our lakefront and the needs for more parks. There also is a need inland to deal with the sewers backing up and the flooding into our homes. And this is a solution towards that. And finally, you might come here because you are on a park advisory council. And as you care for that park advisory council, you might be looking at the concrete surfaces that are in your park. And they might be the parking lot that needs to be replaced. And as you make suggestions to the park district, this hopefully will give you some redesign ideas about what they could do next, instead of doing what we've always done, helping us to deal with this heat island effect and other factors that Mary Pat will share with us today. So I'm so excited to introduce our speaker, Mary Pat McGuire, who I said is a landscape architect and a professor at the University of Illinois, Champaign-Urbana, and runs the Depave project that's here in Chicago. To hear more about all of this important work around Depaving Chicago, a design approach and program to re-nature paved grounds in our communities. So Mary Pat, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you. Shall I go ahead and get started?
Yes,
And
please.
I want to say thank you so much, Julie, first for that setup. That was amazing and a perfect promo for the material I hope to share today. And to Rachel and to Juanita for this invitation. I mean, it's just great. Let me go ahead and share my screen. All right, can you all see that?
Yes, we can.
It's okay. All right, great. So I want to start by first asking, there's a lot of people in the room. I'm sorry that we're not physically together, but to turn your cameras on just for a moment, just to say hi. So I just get a lot more energy by seeing all of you. And there's some familiar faces, some new faces. I'm really looking forward to the discussion at the end of this session. So thanks to you, who could turn on or give a shout out in the chat, or however we can reach each other and kind of animate this a little bit more across the lines. I'm very interested in meeting people across the region who have shared thinking about transforming our city. And I'm, again, really grateful to Friends of the Parks for reaching out and inviting Depave Chicago to participate in this redesign series. I think it's a perfect topic to include because when we're talking about depaving, we are talking about disruptive thinking, we're talking about redesigning and remaking a lot of our infrastructure, and we need to do it through natural systems. So depaving is a part of that toolbox. And I'm going to go ahead and get started. Let me make sure this is all working properly. All right, I want to start too because I know some people might need to drop off early. We're going till 1:30, which is really terrific to have that generous amount of time. But if you're leaving early, my contact information is here on this slide. Please feel free to reach out to me by email at mpm1@illinois.edu. There are two websites that contain a lot of the material that I'll share today. The first is thewaterlab.org and then depavechicago.org, which is specific to that Depave program. And then Depave Chicago and myself are both on Twitter, and Depave Chicago also is set up on Instagram. So we're trying to share a lot of the research behind this program and a lot of the activities around the startup with you. So please reach out to that and email me directly if you have ideas or questions. So today what I want to do is try to connect the dots about why we should be depaving and reducing imperviousness in our city, but to leave you with a few key ideas under that broad topic. The first is that the urban ground plane is a kind of infrastructure in most modernized and industrialized cities. We have to understand that the role that the ground has played as a kind of engineered infrastructure, and we need to redesign it as a natural infrastructure rather than relying on pavement and pipes. The second is that when we're doing that, we need to take a land-based approach, a landscape-based approach, and to embrace the soils of Chicago, the hydrologies of Chicago, to be reconstructing and regenerating those. And that's key to this naturalizing process, key to reimagining our city as a landscape. I also want to share some examples of depaving projects that offer inventive ways of restructuring the ground in cities. And these might inspire you to further develop some ideas that you already have, but just to leave you with the general message that there are low-tech achievable ways of remaking the ground plane and that are beautiful and very functional. And lastly, I want to share with you again about the startup of the Depave program here in the city, and hopefully to get some suggestions from you about places where you think we should be depaving, and just to get, I'm excited to hear ideas about this. So we're at a phase of getting input into the program. Okay, so we're going to start with urban ground as a part of an engineered infrastructure. And I first want to say that a lot of the design and the research that I'll share today is available through our website, thewaterlab.org. We are a small design studio that operates through the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. We're affiliated with the Department of Landscape Architecture and the College of Fine and Applied Arts there. We have a small space downtown that we're just kind of getting started up now, and we'll hopefully be hosting some of our meetings over the coming year there. I am an associate professor in the Department of Landscape Architecture. I am also a licensed landscape architect. I was previously teaching at IIT in Chicago and have been at the U of I now for about 8 years and split my time between the campus at Urbana-Champaign and the city of Chicago. And our design studio is specifically looking at issues of urban flooding and climate adaptation. And we do that specifically by focusing on the ground surface of, the ground surface conditions of cities. And we're trying to identify ways of transforming paved and compacted ground to affect greater human and ecological resilience. And we've been working on issues of water historically, but also moving much more into the issues of urban heat island through that work. And as a result, have set up this program, Depave Chicago, which I will talk about more a little bit later. But we have a dedicated website, depavechicago.org, if you want to go there for some preview information. So again, we're primarily looking at the condition of urban ground. We're really interested in pavement, repavement, lots of engineering to get rid of water. A majority of our public land surfaces in Chicago are designed for mobility and for drainage. And in that process, the surface of land has been highly engineered in a way that externalizes nature and ecological systems, and even a kind of human experience, and including the impacts that it has on human health. And under the design tab on the waterlab.org website, you'll see a series of studios and funded projects that are profiled there that share everything from, in the upper left, research on neighborhood scale green stormwater infrastructure work, for example, that we did in the Calumet region. We share a lot of cross-sectional design strategies showing different ways of retrofitting the ground for different soil types, different runoff reduction targets, and applied to neighborhoods. We've done some paver design work. We've also been looking at the histories of land to try to inform and inspire different approaches. For example, looking at water access in the Calumet region. So a lot of the work that's been presented and that I've done has been done with students through studios, through seminars, and a lot of it has also been funded by regional and national level funding. And so at its core, though, our work is aiming to transform the surface of land from that section at top that says not this to the one below that says this. So basically, we're trying to see the surface of urban land as a more critical interface. So going back to what Julie was sharing, between earth and atmosphere. So we're getting a higher degree of hydrologic, thermal, and even a kind of human environmental exchange that's occurring through that surface. And so what we're trying to do is show where we can affect that change through disruption by integrating green infrastructure along the way. And that beautiful section at the bottom that kind of illustrates that point. The credit for this diagram goes to one of my former grad students, Elizabeth Vogel, who really got this and helped us to advance our work to systematically think about how to work through that surface, regenerate the processes through that surface, thinking about the role of plants and soil specifically. So again, a lot of this originally looked at the relationship between water and pavement, and we still do. Pavement is the kind of headwaters to an urban watershed. You could think about it that way. And particularly that's important to acknowledge when we live in a combined sewer shed in the city of Chicago and certain other areas outside of the city limits. So we can see the impact in our waters of our land cover and the surface materiality of our cities. So on the left is an image of a combined sewer overflow, one where we have to, release the water through the locks. These happen less often than they used to, but where that untreated sewage is basically released out into the lakes and it resettles on our shorelines, of course, because we're in a combined sewer context. But pavement isn't just about water quality impairment or pollutant discharge. It's also contributing to localized urban flooding throughout our city and our region. It's contributing to urban heat island, as was discussed. It's stealing our soils. It's damaging root systems and limiting the extension of those, the volume of those root systems. And it's contributing to a kind of visual homogeneity, which is really critical for kind of human perception of your environment, but also the ecological perception or the perception by other animals and birds migrating as well. And we also, and as many probably here today already know, that we can see the impact in our communities directly. These maps are probably very familiar to you, but it's worth saying at the start and kind of underscoring what Julie was saying too about the role of heat island. Heat island is also tied to poor air quality, the concentration of industry next to our frontline communities, the roadway infrastructure that's related to that, as well as the kind of flooding that's occurring in our neighborhoods. And it's disproportionately impactful throughout the neighborhood, with low wealth and Black and Brown and BIPOC communities hit hardest by urban non-overbank flooding, street flooding, sewage backups. And there's, over time, aside from the kind of human health impact, there's a kind of psychological impact. In particular, communities down in the Calumet have told me that there's like a fear every time it rains. And that's kind of what, what a lot of people are living with. And I wanted to also just highlight the specific map where industrial corridors are marked on this map on those communities. I want to talk a little bit about the role of industrial corridors later, but to understand that land use and some of our zoning practices are just continuing to exacerbate the situation right now. So pavement percentage and concentrations of pavement are national, nationally set, and also by land use. We have a ubiquity of pavement across the continents. Roadway infrastructure itself can kind of be read across our country. Satellite images as early as 2004 started to reveal that we have 43,000 square miles of pavement across the country, which is roughly the size of Ohio. And even though cities only occupy 2% of urban land area, 28% of the nation's pavement is concentrated there. And within those cities, those percentages of pavement are also organized by land use. So if you look at the image on the right-hand side in the kind of bar graph, percentages of impervious, so I should say pavement constitutes the majority of imperviousness by percentage in each land use, which is really important to acknowledge, because a lot of times we talk about imperviousness and we think building footprints a lot of times, but actually pavement constitutes the majority of that impervious footprint by land use. And we know we have histories of road system development and post-World War II expansion, like in urban sprawl. We had really big street dimensions that we inherited through former planning and minimum parking requirements, things like that, that really ballooned pavement in cities and suburbs. And some cities are doing much better now in terms of developing better design practices for parking lots and integrating green infrastructure in new development. And even some cities eliminating parking minimums, which is really exciting. But we have a long way to go here in Chicago. We don't really have a kind of approach. We don't have a really systematic approach toward reducing imperviousness in the city. In Chicago, we have upwards of 80% imperviousness across some parts of the city. Again, remember that pavement constitutes a larger percentage of that imperviousness. 30% of the land surface is streets and other kinds of pavement like parking lots. 23% of our land surface is just in streets, whereas 10% of our city is in parks. We're way below the average of 15 to 17% of park percentage in our city of Chicago. So from a land perspective, this surface condition of pavement is a really critical medium for us to be attacking through redesign, specifically having to do with meeting goals of climate adaptation and heat island reduction, reducing the impacts of storm intensity, and then also addressing the increased need for parks and public space. So we can really like address both of those at the same time. I think it's also worth noting before we leave this slide that 12% of our land is in those industrial corridors. Actually, we have a lot of industrial land in the city of Chicago. So this is all a huge area of opportunity for adaptation. And equally important to understand the role of pavement is that it is directly related to the less visible subsurface collection system underground. So all of that pavement is actually designed, again, remember I said it was the headwaters to the waterways, or it's basically the headwaters to the urban watershed. All that pavement is basically draining the surface underground into a collection system. It's incredibly impressive, the way that it is organized and been designed, and we do need TARP. But TARP is also under capacity for climate change. That's already been acknowledged that we need to address stormwater collection and volume control back at the surface of the city. So we could do double effect. It makes sense to work back to the surface, not just because we need, and we could use gardens rather than parking lots, but because we can handle a lot of that stormwater control across that city. And we can also do it sub-geographically. So where there's a shortfall of both green infrastructure and sewer capacity, those two things could be addressed simultaneously. And lastly, it's also important to remember that land cover is also a huge climate buffer. You know, initiatives like the 30 by 30 initiative, that's thinking at continental, like at regional and continental and planetary scales, could also be applied to our cities. So Johan Rockstrom, if you're familiar with their work, he and his colleagues at the Stockholm Resiliency Center, they've been writing about the 9 planetary boundaries, which are basically processes that regulate the stability and the resiliency of the Earth. They have been saying for years that land cover in particular, is the critical climate buffer at all scales for those other systems. So if you think about it in terms of like the impacts of a storm, you know, that's coming through our city, that is the nature of our ground that's going to help us buffer that. And this is because we have had such land system change at all scales. We have converted a lot of the surface of the planet to human use. And also this is of course true in cities. We've taken out our forests, we've taken out our wetlands. These are the systems, the sort of surface infrastructure, natural infrastructure, that's the driving force behind the loss of biodiversity, for example. It's impacted the water flows at different scales, and is responsible also for helping us to sort of cycle carbon, cycle nitrogen, and other important elements back through our not just the earth system, but our urban areas. So forests and wetlands play an incredibly important role in cities to buffer climate. And so in other words, you know, depave, plant trees is a good approach, you know, here in terms of urban conservation in our most developed areas. And this is also why I've enjoyed conversations and a lot of early support from folks like the Chicago Regional Trees Initiative, US Forest Service, Open Lands, Forest Preserves, Nordson even. They're all reaching out as friends of the parks and saying, this is a key, the dual actions of depaving and planting need each other at this time. And so it's that land system change that I'm really interested in. So I want to talk a little bit about considering the urban ground as a natural infrastructure and returning to the land, soils and hydrology in Chicago, and kind of getting us looking at that. So in talking about the surface of the city today even, it's helpful to understand its hydrogeologic history. Because Chicago was settled in a very, very rich watery crossroads between the Great Lakes and the Mississippi River Basin to the west. This is a very thin margin of land, as you can see in the left-hand image, at the foot of the lake, separated by the subcontinental divide and the moraine just to the west and the southwest. And that lake plain itself, that was deposited, the soils there that were deposited by glaciers are very rich and very varied. And those soils then also were moved around through different kinds of wind and water processes and developed like a series of shorelines you can see. Okay, that shorelines that accreted over time by the lake retreating. And so there was also a lake here under where it reads Chicago Plain. There was a lake here that drained naturally through a shallow point in the moraine called a sag. And that water draining out occurred about 10,000 years ago. And there was a wet marsh left behind. The pre-urbanized landscape was a landscape of water. But it wasn't just wet marsh. There was savanna there, the two prairie streams that meandered through there, and a very rich coastal ecology too, of beaches and dunes, and I mean, just an incredibly diverse area, so ecologically. And this wet condition was extremely valuable to the landscape. It flooded seasonally, so it provided a space of water that could be floated across for hunting and fishing. And there was that watery connection between the Great Lakes to the east and the Mississippi watershed to the west is what provided what was called Chicago portage. This is the shortest geographical location or reach, it's called, between these two navigable waterways. This is, why colonizers basically settled here and colonized this land. They were staking out this strategic location. And in the process of that urbanization, they really struggled with that wetness. So indigenous people in this area, they knew how to use and live in this landscape. They used the portage to navigate and float across. And there were some indigenous villages here. They were in higher land areas. And if you're interested in that history, you might look at the 1900 map by Albert Scharf, CHARF, that maps out that the indigenous sort of occupation of this area. But in the Western mindset, in terms of urbanizing this area, it became increasingly difficult. And over time, the city was drained, flattened, straightened, channelized, paved, raised, everything you can do to kind of try to counter and get away from that kind of watery nature of the landscape. And so that former lake plain, that prairie type of hydrology was over time effectively erased, gridded, and paved over, and those two primary rivers were straightened into hydraulic canals. And that process, I think, is important to acknowledge as we think about moving forward. We have to kind of looking at that past to understand that that process was the beginning of a transformation of control of the landscape as a spatial territory. And we might return a kind of terrain thinking to the landscape as we think about depaving and kind of renaturalizing or rewilding the city. And so here on the left, you can see the Northwest Ordnance Grid was laid over the ecological landscape. Again, this is a really terrific map for anybody who's interested in looking at these. This is the Reese map from 1851. This is also the original, or an original is available in the Newberry Library. You can make an appointment and go there and see that. It's a great afternoon, really beautiful. And I've been, as you can probably tell, really engrossed by this history of the city. And then again, land systems change, and thinking about how do we work back with greater knowledge, or sort of reminding ourselves about this place. So I've been observing this ground from above, looking at remnant dune swale landscapes. I've also been traipsing around over the years, looking for these systems on the ground and understanding them not just as kind of geologic histories that are useful for us to refunctionalize the landscape around us, but they're very psychological and very exciting, rediscoveries of the incredible ecology that still exists here and that can be regenerated. But I've also been looking at again, in a map sense, looking at the USGS record of these systems too. So on the left is in 1902, a very early surficial geology map. And it demonstrates, you can see in the yellows and the tawny colors and the kind of patterns that you see, particularly along the coast from 5 to 10 miles inland, that the coast had this real heterogeneity of soils. And you can read the dune ridge in there and some of the larger beach ridges. And these are very invigorating to the imagination. In addition to looking at that 1902 geological record, I also pulled out the Burnham and Bennett plan of 1909. So this plan of the city came out 7 years after the USGS map. So early planners could have used and referenced some of that soil variability to structure the city and to structure the landscapes in Chicago. But it doesn't really figure, that geologic knowledge at the time doesn't really figure in the landscape network of our city plan. Instead, landscapes and streets are more diagrammatically figured. Again, they're sort of gridded, they're following that Northwest grid. But the distribution of parks also seems to kind of, demonstrate kind of an urban democratic social ideal, let's say, of the distribution of those park systems, but they don't have a real relationship with the hydrogeologic nature of the city. And that's an interesting thing in thinking about renaturalizing the city and where parks might go, about how we might look back at that history. So I'll just leave that out there for you to consider. There's also a very practical use of that material richness. So early on, we started doing correlation mapping of surface conditions, again, imperviousness with subsurface soils and the prevalence of flooding. We're really looking for areas of the city where you can see in the left-hand images, concentrations of flooding that might owe themselves to surface cover, and we're trying to kind of reveal the opportunities for depaving in certain neighborhoods where we know that the soils underneath are coarser, where we can get higher infiltration rates through there. So I didn't bring a lot of this research to this talk, but I just wanted you to know that there is evidence, and we've developed more of this research in recent years to demonstrate the role that soils have in green stormwater infrastructure planning. So again, that's back on our website, and I'd be happy to talk about that offline if anybody's interested. The image on the right-hand side is also really beautiful. This is a LiDAR image from just a few years ago that demonstrates also that LiDAR is a topographic image. And it also reveals those landscape forms, those coastal forms, and those soils that exist under there. And this is a portion of the south side of Chicago, and also running through Washington and Jackson Parks, but through the neighborhoods as well. So hopefully you can kind of glean out of that those forms and start to see through the landscape through our built constructed environment. And on the right is a kind of drawing that I also created with one of my research assistants. This is a map of all of the asphalt paving and compacted ground, except for the two park areas, but all the asphalt and compacted vacant land that exists over beach sand, to provide another guiding visualization of all of the potential opportunities for transforming the surface of the city focused on that landscape history. So if you were to remove asphalt, or you were to start to decompact land, you would find different types of soils, sandy soils underneath in this part of the city. And we also did a lot of visual field surveys. So we did a lot of moving around through neighborhoods and photographing the traces of landform figures. So this is an image, this is a beach ridge that runs down Vincennes, and then it also continues down in the northwest part of Washington Park. So these things can actually be read through the landscape. And I just find that fascinating, So like while we're thinking about future parks or other kinds of things, like, the memory of this incredible history is available to us. And then lastly, one more image to share is that I paired on the image on the left, that inventory of that surface material, so like pavement and compacted vacant land, with cross sections on the right-hand side. So these are cross sections through the blocks in the 40s, 41st through 47th, that basically describe these dense neighborhoods as landscapes that can be read through their topography combined with their soils. So the question there is, like a design or redesign question is, how do you disrupt that surface on the left to reveal that surface on the right, if that makes sense, or that landscape on the right? So that is a question that I just carried with me in a lot of my work. And I've worked with a lot of wonderful soil scientists in the area, and working with their drill rigs to sample sites to get cores, which sort of act like these small apertures into the ground, so we can reimagine rain reconnecting with that soil below. And a lot of this work has also been inspired by the work of artists who are also taking things apart in their work and drilling through and cutting sites and systems open to see within. And so Gordon Meta Clark is imaged on the right, but the work of people like Michael Heiser and other land artists are also very, very inspiring. So when we're thinking about redesigning, we're actually going through first a process of rediscovering and opening up the site and opening up the city. We have a lot of soil cores that we've taken, we have a lot of soil data now. If anybody wants to access that work, please contact me. We also did a lot of amosimeter testing, which is a saturated hydraulic conductivity testing, where you study different infiltration rates in soils. And again, that's been mapped back and modeled back into a lot of our research around green stormwater infrastructure. Okay, so I think that material is really informative, but we're going to take a moment here now and actually look at a few examples of depaving. Okay, I'm going to switch gears a little bit and look at some design. And these designs are outside of the city of Chicago. I think it's really good to look outside of ourselves too, although there are some good examples inside too. We can learn some great permeable parking lots, for example. Out at Wharton Arboretum is like a rock star of permeable paver treatment. So, but we're going to look at a plaza, a street, an old airfield, and a shoreline. And not just typologically though, I'm very interested in how different material strategies are also involved in these projects, so that you can kind of mix and match a material strategy and a site type, and start thinking about how these can inform some of your own ideas. I would say that today almost all sites are actually a remade ground. So designers are using pattern and topographic and material reconfiguring those things to transform sites through their surfaces. So they're using strategies of depaving, repaving, taking back roadways, creating aesthetic tactile surfaces, re-engineering soils, or even designing much larger scale surfaces for more intense environmental and sensorial controls and effects. So for example, the image on the lower right is a park. This is in Amsterdam. To the left, not imaged, is the Amsterdam airport. And this is a large park that was designed as a fully cut fill operation of the existing soil in these ridges that are about 10 to 12 feet high. They do vary in height, that are used to dampen and deflect sound waves from the airport from reaching the community adjacent. So surface design itself, aside from the depaving projects that we'll look at, is used for environmental control. And yet it also makes this incredible park experience where you're walking through basically what feel like, they're sort of constructed dunes. There's a big art piece that has this incredible dampening effect too for the community. And I want to bring these to light because I think there are many, maybe outside of the field of landscape architecture, who think about landscape as still maybe potentially a passive background. Much of our historic parks are designed as a kind of passive background of lawns and trees, but our field has for decades now been working hard to intervene into the idea of landscape as this passive background, and much more as a kind of active, proactive, re-engaging series of projects that are engaging materiality and thinking about public space and kind of human sensorial experiences in different ways. I would say that in the last 25 years, we've seen a proliferation of different project approaches, specifically doing just that, foregrounding landscape, but also taking on the infrastructural nature of our cities. So on the left is an example of a parking day. I mean, how many of you maybe have participated in parking day? This is kind of a phenomena that came out of it's the name is escaping me. In San Francisco, there was a really great group doing temporary, I think they were called rebar, doing temporary installations, but taking over parking spaces, and even putting change into the meter and then taking over that spot for an hour or a day or something. Basically, those were statement projects early on, but they've led to more permanent pop-up streetscapes. We definitely saw a lot of that use in the pandemic of taking over and reappropriating public space and roads for people. There's also a lot of interest in keeping those pedestrian only. On the right-hand side, but this is a situation on the left where you're basically putting something on top of the asphalt. You're not removing the asphalt, you're just inserting a new design on top. On the right is an early drawing of the High Line in New York City, where a piece of abandoned rail infrastructure, it was redesigned as public space. And this was really just to start to integrate planting inside of an existing rail infrastructure. And so these are just two different types of techniques and technologies for kind of overtaking, rethinking, and reimagining infrastructural surfaces that dominate the urban environment. But that first act, I would say, in depaving in particular, is one of material intervention. We're seeing a lot of ways of unmaking and remaking that surface of pavement through, and that are both constructive, deconstructive, and then reconstructive, where we're also reusing materials. There are fabulously low-tech ways of remaking parking and pavement surfaces that for me are really important to learn more about and to utilize in the Depave Chicago program, because they can be more easily utilized across communities that might have lower resources and means to take on projects, but where taking paving away and planting trees should not be so hard. And we can do that with great precision and care, so that redesign is very, very carefully constructed, bringing good design to each project. That image in the lower right-hand side, I just want to say briefly and just give a nod to, this was actually one of the first depaving projects, depaved gardens in the country, at least that's been documented. It's a group of landscape architects who collectively purchased a cooperative housing situation, and the backyard was all paved. They had a mini design competition, and they decided that they would drill lines across the paving, something they could easily do with a jackhammer, and planted that. And every year they would plant it with slightly different things, and sometimes with edibles, edible food. And so they, this project, I think, signaled, this was in 1999, signaled a kind of return to the urban ground and thinking about simple operations to transform those sites. So a lot of people attribute the first depaving project to Depave in Portland in 2007, but this actually predates that a bit. And so the first project of 4 that I want to share then is the Urban Outfitters headquarters in Philadelphia. This was done by Dirt Studio, led by Julie Bergman. This is a well-known project in our field. I think it serves as a really great model for creatively reusing in situ materials. And the approach was to cut up, grind up, and then basically relay materials back into the site. And to do so, not in a nostalgic way, but in a way of like provoking site memory or preserving site memory by keeping some of the traces of that former site use, for example, in the rails in place, and then reusing those rails as pathways, for example. This was a former Navy shipbuilding yard. And in that process of reusing those materials, there was a drastic reduction in both energy costs and material costs because they weren't then going out and sourcing new materials or expending all of the energy related to that construction. So they literally busted up old asphalt and concrete, grinded up those materials and relayed those back and planted groves in between. And so you can see there's a little sectional diagram on the screen. So they went from that section on the left, that's the not this section, to this section on the right, where they transformed the performance of that site by cutting up that section and driving new or developing new now hydrologic and thermal exchanges through that. So water infiltration, evaporation, transpiration happening through new trees. And basically the ground is like breathing again. And they did this by working with the contractor very closely to pull up all the surface pavements, sort and stockpile them so you can see the different concretes, the bricks, the asphalt. They even calculated the dump trucks of material that they saved from being hauled off the site. And you can see them playfully naming them too as, and I say they, this is really Julie Bergman herself, naming them as Barney Rubble and Betty Rubble, for those of you who know the reference. And then they diagrammed where those materials would be used back in the site. And so on the left is the Barney Rubble, going into place. The larger concrete slabs are now laid back into the urban plaza, and the trees are planted in between the pavers, and then in between is backfilled with crushed stone. And so that kind of approach, it gives you a way, the thing to take away from this project is that you can develop a materials palette just from the site itself. So you can go from a fully densely paved site to a more diverse and open ground plane just by designing from within the existing site materials. So even steel was left in place, and new planting there was some new steel planters, I have to say, also put in that were developed, new planters around one of the core central areas of the headquarters. But aside from that, it was basically new planting that was brought in. And here's a more recent image of the plants and trees that are growing up in this restored ground. This is an example, also a really good example of a kind of urban industrial aesthetic that kind of preserves site memory, here it's along the Delaware River. So the second project is in Barcelona. This is a 4-block long boulevard that extends, it basically extended, if you can see my cursor, the former existing edge of the sidewalk was here. It extended, and this was all paved. So it extended introduced a garden in this zone and extended the sidewalk out here and removed lanes of parking in the process. So that expanded street surface dimension kind of thickened this more human realm along the edges of the boulevard. And you can see the balance really shifted from one that's paved to one that has become garden and much more human focused. They preserved a section of large trees. So in the middle are the kind of iconic sycamores, here in the middle row. And then they planted 2 edges of trees, one along the sidewalk and one along the street. And they converted that sidewalk to garden and the street to garden, effectively creating one broad width of garden space between the sidewalk and the drive lanes here. You can see where this is in the city in the upper left. It's 4 blocks in the Charter District, and actually then continued. There's a phase 2 of this project that moved down. In the lower left, if you can read this diagram, so there were rows of existing trees, new trees planted on the other side. So you have like a triple LA there. And then benches were inserted, and there were shrub cutouts in the ground plane. And then the surface itself is interesting. It's a kind of striped ground where they alternated modular ash bricks and turf bands. So there's kind of a striped ground plane parallel from the street edge toward the building face. And this kind of use of both pavers and planting is you find this increasingly common in a lot of urban landscape projects, where you get a kind of hybridity between something that's urban and has some structure to it, but that it allows for water infiltration and plant growth to happen in the in-between spaces. And so it actually looks like a kind of carpet running down the street. And the depth of that very seemingly thin striped surface also enables, again, different ecological processes to take through there. So there's different vegetation that's planted in different plots there. And so the whole site kind of operates as a garden, even though it reads very much as kind of an urban living room in a way. And it absorbs water, exchanges air, and also that root zone is then expanded, and then an entire area that was previously asphalted now is much more of a kind of operates as a garden functionally and ecologically. So this is, I think, a really interesting precedent project for us in Chicago too, thinking about remaking our urban surfaces, particularly in our streets and in our boulevards. And I can't help but think about Stony Island Avenue, for example. It is a long section that would continue the boulevard, actually, the boulevard system from Jackson Park down to 99th, and it is just full of paving. So you might think about some of those really, really wide avenue opportunities as ways to remake those as social spaces. We also did some social ecological studies of these landscapes, and we studied and tracked movement in between. So, people actually moving in, occupying sites, and then moving back out is a very beautiful kind of way of seeing how people are kind of moving through and occupying the site in different ways. Again, just a reminder that those were all paved infrastructure in those cities. The third project that does this in an interesting way too is outside of Frankfurt, Germany. This is an old US Air Force base called Bonames. And the landscape architects of GTL worked directly, in contrast with those other 2 projects, worked directly with the larger community around this site to intentionally demolish a series of pavements on site in this airfield. This was a site in the left-hand side. If you can see, the lower left-hand image is actually just a pavement map. So the black runway was left in place. That's the image on the right. They wanted to leave that in place for things like biking and roller blading and all kinds of stuff. They wanted to keep a piece of paving, but all the other gray was demolished in different ways. And in the upper right, albeit it's quite small, but you can see in the green, that was everything that was gray became green right there. And that site was recognized as a kind of hole in the larger green belt of this area. And the community really wanted to get rid of that site. They wanted to replace that pavement. And so the LAs the landscape architects worked with them to develop different strategies or different approaches in different pockets of this site. So they created different pavement sections where pavement sections were cut up in different shapes and sizes, and some of them were removed and stacked up in some places. And so that's what A, B, and C are. Some of them were removed and stacked up. Some of them were cut up and just popped open. Some of them were broken up and on site. And so the idea that they had for this site was that, okay, yes, nothing also would leave the site, but nothing would come in either to the site. Only 50 trees were donated for this whole project. Otherwise, they cut up pavement sections and distributed them through the site. And this was basically to structure different kinds of activities, different areas to explore, to try to get different biotopes going in the landscape too. And really they just saw it as a kind of experiment, a kind of community and ecological experiment, that the whole site becomes fractionated by different dimensions. And on the left-hand side, you can see some of the sketches. They actually didn't create even a real plan for this, like a drawing plan, the way you would think about a landscape design. They developed strategies and worked with the community and the contractor to break up this pavement. And then, as you can see the image on the upturned slabs, they created sculpture in the landscape. They stacked it up. And then, yeah, had different kinds of celebrations and events throughout there. And over time, they basically turned a desert of pavement into a kind of forest, and different kinds of wetlands also emerged on the site. The site also has been studied rigorously by area researchers. So a number of ecologists were finding that within 10 years that the biodiversity of the site was so increased and so strong that they had to start shutting it down during birding and breeding season to keep people off the site. So they completed their greenbelt goals. They diversified the site through this incredible strategy of just breaking things up and allowing nature to kind of move in. And there's a really rich mosaic that resulted there. And again, I think this is something interesting in Chicago to think about, these rules of not taking anything away and don't adding anything to it, that a simple reorganization of the surface might initiate some transformation. So when we talk about renaturalizing or rewilding, there are sites that demonstrate that these things are working quite well. They also invited water back into the site. There was actually a stream that was running underneath underneath the airport before it was paved. And so that also got opened up and revealed in the process and became kind of like pond and almost a kind of little beachfront for them. So the last project that I want to share too is on the boards with Conger Mosquiard, landscape architects in San Francisco. They were actually the ones who did that original crack garden. So 20 years later, they've gone from cutting up asphalt in their backyards to now looking at these incredible infrastructural sites in the San Francisco area. This is a 12-acre site. It's a tarmac of a former naval air base in Alameda, on Alameda Point in the San Francisco Bay. And they are proposing to demolish the pavements on site and redistribute them as a wetland park, in which the rising tides then contribute to a kind of wetland environment there. So they're thinking about sea level rise, or thinking about climate adaptation. So much like the last project, they're using strategies of demolition, but they're really thinking about climate adaptation of the shoreline, sea level rise, and radically changing the shoreline in an urban area. This project might have some resonance for those of you who are thinking about our shorelines here in Chicago, and how do we remake the edges of that to also buffer our own changes that we're experiencing. So the existing conditions there, I mean, in the left-hand image, of course, they're looking over the bay and eventually over the Pacific Ocean, but that image looks very much like, to me, like our lake too. And some of the conditions that we have still on our shorelines. And so they did a lot of inventorying of the existing conditions there, the way that not just the concrete, that exists in the lower images, but that shoreline riprap is really just used in one dimension, one parallel dimension with the shoreline, which really doesn't give you the breaking, doesn't break the wave action on that shore or create any kind of habitat. So their strategies are about removing and repurposing that riprap to create more subtidal habitat, much more kind of nooks and spaces for different fish and aquatic species to inhabit, to repurpose existing concrete slabs on site, and also to then recycle asphalts and concretes to build up landforms. So what they're trying to do is create a diversity of different levels of land, not just to inspire and create different ecological niches, but also to create different physical experiences for people who are traveling and visiting the site. The other thing, not unlike the project at the Urban Outfitters headquarters, but they're also taking kind of climate positive approach here to this project, or at least, if we don't use that term, of analyzing the reduced carbon emissions and how much carbon they might be sequestering by this project. So they're also assessing reusing materials, reducing the typical carbon emissions footprint that would result from, hauling that material out and bringing new materials in. They're also interested in the carbon sequestration potential of the new wetland planting that would happen across the site. So they're very carbon focused, redesigning for adaptation, with a very materials and operational mindset about how we depave, remake, and remake our landscapes. And this is a kind of vision of how they see that evolving. So we're basically in this project, again, flipping from a 90% paved to a 90% planted and floodable landscape that's adapted for a changing coastal environment. It's very, it's based on the site structure that already exists there. And these are interesting ideas for our shorelines too, about how we might take some of the pavements that we're removing and think about them as breakwaters, other kinds of features offshore to start to adapt our communities. All right, so lastly, I have a few minutes left to talk about the Depave Chicago program startup. This is our website. This is the landing page for our website, depavechicago.org. You can find a lot of information there. We're launching this program this year and next year. Depave Chicago is a community depaving program. So we're, of course, interested in doing lots of different types of projects, but with a very community-centered approach. We want to work on helping to be a part of the process of replacing underutilized parking lots and paved spaces and replacing those, transforming those with gardens, forests, and other kinds of nature-based designs. And as you see, we have an open call for a pilot project. Depave Chicago is really part of a much larger growing movement of depaving across the country. And the goal is not just to do the projects, but to do it with each other, to be collaborative and to be hands-on, and for everyone to be able to participate in some way. I think we really want communities to be stewards of their own neighborhoods and lands around them. And so we're part of a network across the country, and actually internationally. There are projects popping up. There's the very established program in Canada, and then other programs in the UK, and one coming out in France. The program startup is supported by the Really Resilient by Nature grant by the Walter Foundation, which many of you know are just funding incredible, nature-based programs around the city and region right now. And our funding includes the hiring of Depave in Portland, the original Depave organization, for the training and consulting of our participants, and the cost of a pilot project coming up next spring. And then we also have stipends available for participants and for special crew leader training. So be sure to please reach out if that's of any interest to you. We also in this process will be developing a parallel set of materials that Depave offers on their website, as does Depave Puget Sound, that helps us all on a community basis think about how do we depave in our communities? How do we investigate sites? How do we bring a design process around that? How do we study stormwater management or stormwater design on sites? Where's their funding to do projects like this? How do we go through the process of permitting a depaving and greening project? So we have a lot of technical information that will start to populate on our website. Hopefully that will all be present by the end of next year. We'll help everybody walk through. And then the other important piece is that, you do the work yourself. You learn the physical process of depaving, and that is a lot of fun. So I brought a video. I don't know if this will play, but I participated in a project with them recently, where what you do is you basically cut up the paving in advance of the depave day. You cut it up with a walk-behind blade, a saw, and you cut it up like a brownie pan into these squares, so you'll see here, and there's always music playing. This is before the volunteers show up. So everybody in the yellow vest is a crew leader, and all the wheelbarrows are there, and the pry bars and the bins are there. So this is the setup, before you get started. These things are remarkably easy to do and set up. And so I'm excited to learn to do this with others here. Other images, so you can see people after we pried out the asphalt, just putting it in the wheelbarrow, hauling it over, to the, let me see if I can get this one going. Okay, there's lots of music always, and everybody's working across the site, having a good old time. It was remarkable how much fun everybody had, taking lots of breaks, hauling this material off. having lunch together. And at the end of the day, we saw dumpsters full of asphalt paving and a completely cleared site that would be later a bit of excavation happens and then planting of the site. So it was just wild fun and very inspiring. And so that's on the lower right-hand side was everybody at this one project site that we just did last month. So depaving sites has community benefits directly, but it also, I want to say also in the Chicago context, I'm very interested in how we will also become a part of a water management strategy, the way that Depave Puget Sound, image on the left, this is a screenshot from Pierce Conservation District. Their Depave program is actually managed through their Conservation of Land and Soil Water Conservation District. And they do everything from removing driveways for people at their houses to other larger projects like at schools. So there's a whole range of types of projects that can happen. Where we're going to be depaving in Chicago is focusing, of course, on areas of high percentage of imperviousness, working in environmental justice communities along highway corridors, rivers, industrial areas, and site types could include anything from schools to city-owned sites to commercial parking lots. Again, it's very community driven. It's really important that we are doing things from within, that we're also using this as an opportunity to talk about the environmental impacts of these programs, and then developing metrics to evaluate those kinds of improvements, again, determined by community values. Again, we'll be looking at areas of high concentrations of pavement. It's worth noting that right in here is where the matte asphalt plant is. And actually, I live in this community of McKinley Park too. And we just want to start reversing the trend of thinking about more asphalt and instead thinking about less asphalt, recycling the asphalt that we have and starting to renature our communities. We have an open call for pilot projects. There's information on the website about that. We welcome proposals. We're reviewing proposals, doing site visits and following up on those recommendations. If you're interested in participating in Depave Chicago, you can enter your information on the website too, and we'll follow up and just start to include you on all of the updates and future online meetings that we have. And eventually, what we're gearing toward now is a project in 2023 in April, where we'll do a Depave, we'll do planting, and in between now and then, all of the engagement, site design processes, all the contracting, volunteer outreach, et cetera. So if you want to get involved, please let us know. So now I just want to close up. I know this is, you've really indulged me. I'd love to get some feedback. I just want to leave you with the fact that, ground is an urban infrastructure. It can be increasingly, though, transformed into a natural infrastructure by refinding soils, by refinding the land in our communities. And there are really inspiring examples out there of depaving that create new planted plazas, streetscapes, garden boulevards, new biotopes, different hydric environments, just by busting up paving, allowing nature to settle in, and or doing more intentional planting to try to develop different types of ecologies there. And we can be doing shoreline adaptation this way. So I'm really excited to hear feedback, thoughts, reactions, and where we should be depaving and what should be taking root instead. So with that, I will close my screen. And
thanks,
maybe we can
Mary
open it up, Rachel.
While you've been speaking, there have been some questions that have come in. So we can also, folks want to raise their hand or write in the chat. One question was, how would you describe and measure the health impacts of depaving as one of the arguments for undertaking the cost, especially in parts of the city that don't have as much tree cover?
Sorry, can you repeat that again?
Yeah, how would you describe or measure the health impacts of depaving as one of the arguments for the expense, especially in parts of the city that have less tree cover?
Oh my gosh, that's such a great idea. That's such a great question. And who asked that question?
Ellen.
Ellen, do you have thoughts on that? Maybe she's not here anymore, or they're not here anymore.
Or doesn't want to unmute, but yeah.
I think that's a great question and a complicated one. And I don't think that's one that I can fully answer today, because the health impacts are obviously coming from a lot of different directions. And over time, I think the health impacts of community are probably not going to be solved with individual sites, but it's going to be the kind of aggregate of sites over time in communities. But one way that you can start to assess that is by doing, you can do early monitoring, of the health of a community. You can study the air pollution that exists there today, for example, and then study how those are changing over time by the implementation, by the depaving of certain sites and by the implementation of particularly trees. So you can install, air quality monitoring. That's why I wasn't sure about which health impact. That's why I want to ask Ellen a little bit about what health impacts are we talking about. So air pollution is something that you could measure. You could start to measure the decrease of air pollution by these projects. But again, the research on that too is that there are specific, so if you were trying to reduce air pollution, for example, you would plant in a very specific way. You would start to develop vegetation in a way that puts the site, puts the vegetation between the site and between the source of that air pollution. So it's hard to say generally, but much more site specifically, that you could start to implement strategies, depaving and planting strategies site by site to address the source of the impact and then the population experiencing that. Does that sort of get at that a little bit, Rachel?
I think so. That's a great place for us to think.
Health and human health. And if there are experts of that around that on the call, I would love for you to also contribute. I don't necessarily I do not study human health myself. I study more stormwater and the sort of like the water system side of things and the impacts that these projects have on stormwater and water quality. So that might be something I can speak to more. But what I think what we're trying to do though is shift the balance, and to re-canopy. I think there are goals for developing canopy in communities that site by site might start to create that kind of percentage, at a neighborhood scale. But let me just stop there because I'm probably not doing that answering that question very well.
Wonderful. You're getting a lot of positive compliments in the chat.
I was going to say that the heat island thing too, though, is something that you can measure. I mean, you can measure the dramatic, again, this is why the scale of analysis is so important. You can measure the dramatic change on a site by site basis by measuring that surface temperature. You can measure it at the surface, then you can measure the temperature basically at the body scale once you've depaved a site and started to plant a site. And that may be something that Julie's looked at, but you can dramatically reduce that on a site-by-site basis. So I probably should have mentioned that too. Again, it's like I'm wondering, like, what is the thing that you're trying to trace down? But yeah, we all know that impact, don't you? I mean, this summer of walking from a paved or an exposed area right into the shade. I mean, you don't even need like an instrument for that. Your body is a sort of instrument. You can already feel the cooling effect of that. But that could be measured, and air quality could be measured. And of course, stormwater runoff can be measured.
Great. That's very informative. I see that Kate had a couple of questions about the Chicago River. I think you're still with us if you wanted to unmute to ask them yourself. Or I'm happy to read them. So first.
Sure, go ahead and read them for me and feel free to edit them down. They're overcomplicated. You probably just sort of simplify it.
Hey, I appreciate it.
Kate was asking really about our river corridor, our Chicago River and the industrial corridors along there. And in particular, depaving, the ecological impact on the heat islands along the migratory corridors of the river, and also the river is a large system that connects us. What is the relative value of the remediation of these zones for the city?
Oh my gosh, well, that's complicated. And of course, we know that the city does not, well, I mean, this is tough, right? This is a recorded session. You're going to post this too. So Juanita, you want to chime in? But our lands along our waters are like, they're locked up. And we're seeing also an inequity in the way the north side is developing versus the south side. We have a lot of industrial land use. Our working lands are sort of tied to those waterways still. And it's very distressing because so much of it is paved and unvegetated, and those waters aren't really, those waters as sort of as ecosystems aren't really going to make it. But people, I mean, a lot of our communities are living right along there too. And I'm just not seeing, a lot of progressive thinking about how to transition that land use. And or to how to integrate more meaningful ecological redesign of those riverways. You know, where there is excess paving, on underutilized surface paving, why that probably should be revegetated. So I don't know, Juanita's raising or shaking her head.
Yeah, I'll jump in since you asked me to. It is a challenge that we look at as members of the Lincoln Yards Community Advisory Council and on a number of committees looking at development along the river. And though there are river design guidelines that were passed that are supposed to kind of move us towards a more naturalized edge, we don't really see the city committed to that, whether it's new development going on along the river where they ought to be more naturalized, but they're honestly quite committed to new concrete along the river, or whether it's depaving what's already there. That said, maybe this is a time for a little commercial, Rachel, about an upcoming Netsch lecture. So go ahead, Rachel.
Yeah, I actually was going to say that that's part of why I asked it, was to give us a little intro for folks really interested in what we're doing along the river. Our next lecture on September 1 will also be on Zoom during the lunch hour, will be about the river's edge and different things cities have done across the world to naturalize their river's edge. So a nice connection to what we've talked about today.
Can we acknowledge though that what is the edge, you know, because I agree renaturalizing the edge is interesting and important for kind of aquatic species and the sort of the health of the river. However, that edge is variable and very wide, that margin of the river edge in most riverine systems. And a lot of cities are acknowledging that too. So how thick can we think about that edge? How can we renaturalize the surfaces of the river? I think that's an enormous question. And
well,
for Chicago to really, go ahead.
I mean, based on the presentation I saw that inspires this, I think we will get to some of that in the conversation. And just wanted to mention that it's co-sponsored with Friends of the Chicago River, who of course is so key to that work. And, you know, we often, you know, defer to their leadership along the river, but we these days are in so many different constructs with them and contexts where we are together advocating, sometimes with different styles of advocating, but we thought it would be really important to bring forward some conversations and also international examples of where they are looking at the rivers very differently than we are here in Chicago or even in the US.
Yes, so a couple of things too. There's some great stuff in the chat that now that I'm seeing it, but yeah, the Wild Mile is a really exciting project that tries to reintroduce those ecological processes through the surface of the river by bringing that kind of floating constructed wetlands approach. That's actually one way of broadening the idea of river edge or surface, you know, where the water is basically surfacing with an ecological planted community and providing habitat. That's a way of extending the river edge into the river in a way. But there's also a great project, I should say, that Chicago Regional Trees Initiative did down in Alsip, headed up by Zach Wertz of that organization. This was an MWRD site in Alsip. It was 2.5 acres of paving that they took out along the Calumet River, Cal-Sag Channel, actually. There are some good examples in the area of depaving along the river. I think it's going to be a tough upward climb, you know, anything south of the loop, basically. It's just all tied up, you know. And but I think we absolutely need to, as Kate's also saying, you know, yeah, we call them in modernization initiatives, or we had the sustainable industrial corridors study where there were proposals for renaturalizing a lot of those industrial corridors. Again, at that time, we inventoried all of the pavement and we said, we can do this differently. And we haven't seen, you know, anything come out of that. So it's not for a shortage of ideas or plans, you know, so we can show lots of examples. I mean, and I think inspiring thinking is good, but I think we have to, yeah, place pressure on the urgency for regenerating those lands and to do it in an equitable way across the city.
Thank you for that, Mary Pat. One quick question that I think relates directly to the end of your presentation, which is, could you explain a little bit further about why community depave efforts can be so low tech, and can be so low tech?
Is this coming from Mike Nowak?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I saw that he was in here. Mike, thank you. That's a really important point. One is that we're trying to make these tools much more accessible. I mean, you can hire a contractor and an excavator to come in, rip up the site, remove it, and come in and plant it. What these programs are trying to do is involve the community and to get everybody involved as a kind of community building process, and also to take ownership of that site. It's incredibly rewarding. It's not just fun, but it's really rewarding to start to do these projects together as a community. And unless Mike wants to say more, because he did a great talk with us earlier this summer, late spring, about the program. It's low tech so that everybody can get involved. We can't sit around and wait for, you know, other people to do these things for us. I think we need to do it in our backyards, in the backyards of our communities. And so that's what this Depave Chicago program is intended to do, that while we have a lot of planning evidence, a lot of research is saying that we need to move in this direction, we're also trying to bring this kind of low tech program and set of tools to communities directly.
If I might jump in,
Yeah.
My question would be, does that limit you? I mean, if you bring in a backhoe, you can get a lot more ripped up a lot faster. And I understand the community aspect of it. The community is important. Anybody who's ever worked in a community, like I used to be in theater, and you have the community of theater, and you have the community of church, and you have the community of gardens as well, community gardens. But if you want to have a real effect, at some point, don't you have to get high tech?
With machines, yeah. Well, to your point is a good one. Yeah, the idea is to affect a lot of change, a lot of transformation, no question. I think you need both. So actually, many of those sites, those Depave sites that, like for instance, in the videos, there is also a contractor involved. So there's a contractor who will come out and take up all the rest of the paving that the volunteers haven't, and will also help to excavate the site down to whatever depth needs to be removed. So it's a both and. The importance of involving the community in the process is, again, that process of engagement and of having people involved. People are choosing to get involved and do these projects. That was what I was so inspired by participating with Depave in Portland this summer, is realizing that the enthusiasm that people have for transforming their neighborhoods, but they're not just seeing it as like coming in and doing the planting afterward. They want to get in and they actually want to rip out that asphalt. It's incredible how gratifying that was for people. So it's a both and. The cost does reduce, I think, in some ways for these communities, for these community projects. The cost does reduce when you limit some of the contractor involvement, but you don't eliminate the contractor out of the equation. Obviously, people are coming and taking that asphalt out of the site, removing it. So there is a contractor involved in the process. And also there's a limit, I think, to what the body and a group of volunteers can do. There's a spatial limit, about 5,000 square feet is what we're learning is sort of the limit of what you can do in a half day when you have a group of, let's say, 30 to 40 volunteers. But that shouldn't limit the site design or the site project either. I mean, if you want to do 10,000 square feet or you want to do more, the community might come in and do a portion of that, and then you might actually have an excavator come in and remove the rest. And that is fine. That is fine, But yeah, I think involving ourselves is a part of this process too. We are the redesigners. We are the, you know, we're part of the tool. We're part of the machine set, I'd say.
Thank
Okay,
you for
thanks.
that, Mary Pat, and thanks for that great question, Mike. And you'll see Juanita put in the chat that that connects to our mission, right? Inspire, equip, and mobilize people. So that's what you're doing too. We need to get people involved so that they'll have more of an investment in these types of projects and in our city and in the design of our communities. So we're just so grateful to you, Mary Pat, for all that you've shared today and this wonderful presentation, and for the Water Lab and Depave Chicago, letting us get some of your insight and see into all that research. Folks can see throughout the chat, we were dropping in those links that were in the presentation as well. So I just want to thank everybody for being here. We're at about a little past 1:30. Thank you so much. We also dropped in the chat links to those events we mentioned. I have one other event announcement, which is on August 20th. We have our every annual year DuSable Park commemoration and anniversary event. We'd love for you to come out to that in person from 11 to 2. I've dropped in the links so you can register for that. It's both going to be online and by the bust of DuSable downtown. We'd love to have you at our next lecture in September, and we'll be sending that out via email, but again, it was in the chat. And you can, of course, email me at rachelbr@fotp.org if you have any other questions or comments or would like to connect with our policy and advocacy work, which is also in the chat. So thank you all so much for coming today. And thank you again, Mary Pat, for such a wonderful presentation.
Thank you all. It's great.
Thank you, Mary Pat. That was great.
Thank you.